Okay, our next speaker is David Andrews with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And a little bit about David as he makes his way up here. He's the engineering supervisor, and he runs their Orphan and Distressed Operator Program. He's the lead for their Distressed and Orphan Operator Program with the COGCC. He works in the rifle office here in Western Colorado. He's always been a great help and asset to me. He's the engineering supervisor, and with that, he will be discussing the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission Orphan Well Program. And the question is, who cleans up after a financially distressed operator? And I believe we will learn that from David Andrews. Thank you, sir.
Good morning. So anyone that's worked in the oil and gas fields for a long time know that, often when you first move into a field, it's more of an explanation scenario, and then as you move on, as we are with the Piceance Basin right now, it's more infill drilling and development. So with the last speaker, he talked about well construction and design over a long period of time, and many of the wells that are left over from operators that end up entering this program are quite old. We've plugged wells that were drilled prior to 1910, so those types of wells normally don't have the same construction standards that we do today, and that's what I'll be discussing. The other part of this presentation is the distressed operator wells, and that results when bonds are claimed from operators, and that may result from bankruptcy. It may result from the operator not being able to implement the proper practices that are required to operate in the state of Colorado. There have been kind of an increase in the number of bond claims over the last few years, and that tends to go along with the prices, where you may have small operators moving into an area when prices are high. When prices tend to bottom out, that's normally when we end up with more bond claims. So just as an historical perspective, drilling really commenced in Colorado in the late 1800s, early 1900s. On the west slope, natural gas was discovered in 1890, and drilling began shortly after. Not long after that, within probably 20 years or so, oil was discovered in the Rangeley field, and that started development of the largest oil field that we've had in the state since then. COGCC was established in 1951, and part of the early regulations covered groundwater protection and plugging and abandonment of wells. Our statutory authority comes from the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. And as part of that act, we have Section 3460-124, which covers the Oil and Gas Conservation and Environmental Response Fund. And that is really a fund that covers all of our agency expenses. But as part of that fund, we have a line item that covers orphaned well plugging and abandonment, reclamation activities, and also environmental cleanup. So if there's a tank battery associated with an orphan well, money from that fund is available to clean up that location as well. And then the other part of it is bond funds. So again, the orphan fund is intended to investigate, so we may need to collect samples, prevent, monitor, or mitigate conditions that cause environmental impacts. So prior to about 1990, we had used bond claims in order to pay for these projects. And in 1990, the legislature first authorized a fund to pay for projects where there may be no bond. So, for instance, an operator may have gone out of business in 1923, which was prior to establishment of the commission, so we didn't have any bonds in place. So we do have those older wells that we need to go into with no bond funds available that we need to plug and abandon. COGCC works cooperatively with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. About once every 5 years, that commission publishes a report that surveys all of the states in the country that have orphan well programs, and they publish statistics on those programs. COGCC also has our 700 series, which cover financial assurance, and those are the rules that provide the background and the requirements for bonding or other financial assurance. So for the orphan well and distressed operator program, we really have three sources within those 700 series rules. One is for surface owner protection for unreasonable crop loss and land damage. So that's if an operator moves in, ends up taking more space than what would normally be allotted for a pad, then that bond may be claimed in order to compensate the surface owner. And in the case of an orphan well or a distressed operator, that money would go towards reclamation of the location. The next part is our soil protection and plugging and abandonment bond, and that is specifically used for the plugging of the well and any cleanup of, say, a tank battery that's associated with the well. And lastly, we have an excess inactive well requirement, so that if an operator has exceeds our threshold on number of idle wells, which would be shut in or temporarily abandoned, or basically don't produce for a period of 12 months or longer, then our financial assurance group goes back to those operators and says, well, you either need to produce those wells, plug those wells, or increase your bonding amount. So in the last few years, we have significantly increased bonding for operators with excess inactive wells, and again, that goes back to price of oil and price of natural gas. So in the past, prior to 2017, we used mostly three methods to help prioritize the wells on the list and our schedule for plugging and abandoning those wells. One was leaking wells. Obviously, if we have a leaking well, that presents a hazard to the environment, so we tended to rank those at the top of the list. Second was complaints, which may come in from a landowner that may have an old well on their property, and we don't have bonding available, or it's an operator that may have drilled it 70, 80 years ago. So we do rely on the public to bring those complaints in, because if the well was not previously registered in COGCC's system, we may not know about it. And then finally, bond claims, and again, this goes to the point of distressed operators. So in the past, if we had a well that was, leaking, came in as a complaint or a bond claim, that would tend to put it right at the top of the list. In 2013, Senate Bill 2013-02 established a field inspection priority system for oil and gas locations, and that basically we looked at different factors that would be involved with locations based on their age, number of spills in the past, that type of thing, to help our inspectors prioritize which locations to look at first and what the frequency of those inspections would be. So we took, in part, the results from that study and looked at three factors in particular. First, population density, second, environmental risk, and third, years in service, which constituted about 65% of the total score for the field inspections. So we're in addition to the last slide where I went through leaking wells and complaints and bond claims, we're also considering how close are these orphan wells to population centers, what are the environmental risks, which may include proximity to surface water, depth to groundwater, and proximity to designated wildlife areas or areas that are mapped in our system. And the third one is years in service. So if we have an older well, that's more likely, as you heard from the last talk, to represent a potential problem than a newer well. Same thing goes with production facilities. So in 2016, last fall, we had a group of our staff go through a lean process improvement event to take a look at the system that we were using to prioritize orphan wells and to schedule those projects and develop some recommendations on how to improve the program. So management came to me in January and asked me to kind of take the existing program that we had, reinvent it in a way to establish some of the goals that were developed during the lean event in 2016. So as part of that, I'm the new program lead. We've developed a new organization structure and reporting structure, and that's mostly so we have consistent internal communication between our various technical work units, along with our hearings unit and financial unit, and also external communication with, say, complainants, the contractors that we hire to perform this type of work, and also local governments. So we've got a system in place to make sure that everyone is aware of the projects that we're working on and what's happening with those projects. Next is shared responsibility with all team members to prioritize the projects. So in the past, it was mostly the engineering group that would develop the priority schedule on which projects we're working on for each fiscal year. As part of the lean process, other units essentially wanted their voices heard more than maybe they were before, to look at other factors like reclamation, weed control, other environmental issues. So we have more priority factors that fit into the system now. And lastly, the task was to develop project management procedures and work specifications. So one of the issues that we've encountered recently is, you know, going from a few projects per year that were mostly orphan projects, and then with the larger bond claims that have been coming in, you know, we've had a couple that have had 50 plus wells. It just increases the scope of our program dramatically. So I'll just kind of pop through some of these. This was our implementation plan that was developed in fall of 2016. Essentially, we're at the point of the last bullet up here right now, April 1st, on starting to track new projects with the lean prioritization criteria. And that really happened around February. So it took about a month to begin setting up the system and the processes in order to make that happen. And we've kind of split it between looking at wells that were on the orphan list that may not have a bond claim, and also the new bond claims that are rolling in, and trying to get those prioritized as quickly as possible. So the eventual plan is to have the process fully implemented for next fiscal year. And one part of that process is changing the format that goes into our staff report that's released with each hearing. And the individual tasks for each of these projects have been broken out in far more detail than they have in the past, along with the accounting for those projects. So anyone that normally looks at our staff report, you can kind of see some of that transition right now. Okay, so this is the new organization for the program. In the past, again, the units tended to work separately, and we have individual unit supervisors and unit managers for the technical units. What we really needed to do with this program was to create more of a collaborative effort. So as the program lead, I'm working more directly with our technical staff with the permission and you know, resource allocation from their supervisors and managers. So it's essentially more of a temporary work assignment, so that way I don't have to run directly through the managers and supervisors to get the work scheduled. Another thing that we've implemented as part of that is the support staff. So out of our enforcement unit, our financial unit, we have support positions that, although they have separate managers and supervisors, they will report directly to me for this portion of the program. The next part of it was assigning different unit leaders for each technical discipline, so that we would have one central point of contact for each technical unit for reviewing specifications, work plans, that type of thing, and also coordinating with their managers to make sure those resources are allocated for the program. The fourth part of it is really scaling the project management to the project size. So for a smaller project where we may have an orphan location, that's just one well, one location, we may have a single field leader and project leader that's handling all of those tasks. As we move to larger and larger projects, especially with these distressed operator bond claims, where we may have 20, 30, 40 wells to take care of, then we'll have one single project leader that will take the project from beginning to end, which will provide a more central point of contact for internal and external interest. As part of this program, we didn't have the necessary project management tools, or we had considered purchasing tools for this, but in the end we ended up using Google Suite. So anyone that's purchased anything online, or maybe went to a hotel recently, often you get a survey back to say, okay, what do you think of the whole process, the purchase? So we ended up building individual data input forms for all the different pieces and parts of the project management process. Part of that is time accounting. So we have kind of a central calendar now. We have a timekeeper, which lets my staff kind of put in what they did for the day, and in the end that allows us to track staff time on this program. So since January 4th, when the whole thing kind of kicked off, we've put in over 700 man hours on developing the process, prioritizing the existing projects in the new system, and getting the ball rolling. We're moving towards the end of the fiscal year right now, so we're kind of in a scramble mode to make sure that we get all the our budget spent for the fiscal year. So as I indicated before, we do need to hire contractors. COGCC doesn't have a workover rig. We don't have staff that normally do roustabout work. So depending on the project size, we either have discretionary spending authority or we have to bid it out over a certain amount. And what we'll be moving towards in the future is really bidding these projects as multiple wells as opposed to one well at a time for efficiency. We also need to deal with junk and salvage disposal at times. So there may be tanks left over, tubing left over, parts of wellheads left on location. So that kind of rolls into the whole contracting part of it, trying to get the equipment salvage as part of the bids. And then lastly, after we plug the well, do any environmental work, we have our reclamation crews come in. So this is an example after a plugging job where we had access to the well that we had to take care of. So in the upper left, we have the essentially graded surface, and then the straw mulch come in. Down lower left, we've got hire contractors with crimpers and seeding capability to get the locations reclaimed. One of the forms that we're using to collect data is more of an internal form to look at our staff qualifications. So we have certain staff that may be in engineering or field inspection units that are more familiar with downhole well work. We may have other staff in our environmental unit that are more familiar with environmental cleanups. And same thing with reclamation. So we're trying to get an internal inventory of our staff, not just experience, but interest in these projects, so we can develop a mentoring program and have more people available to do the supervision. As far as different types of bond claims, and all of these responses from here on are essentially what we've registered in the system, so it doesn't necessarily include historic projects that may go back 5, 10, 15 years. So for the current registrations, most of the bond claims are for individual wells. We have another large percentage that is blanket. So an operator, if they have multiple wells in the state, they may post a blanket bond that covers all of their wells as opposed to individual bonds. And then lastly, excess inactive. So again, that's collected if there's more than a certain threshold of idle wells. For bond types, most of our funding for the bond claims comes from plugging bonds, although we also have bonds for surface, as I mentioned before, and on occasion we'll claim gas facility bonds. So if we have some portion that's tied to midstream, that might come into play. And lastly, bankruptcy deposits. For project discovery, most of our projects come in through enforcement, which would be like a bond claim, or COGCC field inspections. So as part of our new priority system for the field inspections, we have placed a high priority on getting out to look at these old locations. As mentioned during the last talk, we want to focus on the older wells that have a higher probability of being a concern. We also receive some referrals from other external sources, which may be local governments or other agencies that are out inspecting. The historic one noted here, that's more of bringing in some of our older projects from our previous management system. And then as far as project types, as far as the ones that have gone in this year, most of them have been orphans, but this pie is going to be changing a little bit more towards distressed operators because we still have a large backlog of those to get into the new system and prioritize. As far as breaking tasks out, so we are assigning individual tasks for each discipline at each location. You'll see that the majority of them, we have plugging and abandonment concerns. That's at 31%. Another big factor is reclamation at 27%. And that's the initial reclamation, which may include stormwater BMPs and other issues. And that's why, at least as of right now, the stormwater BMPs is at 0 because that's included in reclamation. For other, that's another big one. That's kind of a catch-all that covers roustabout services. If there's a certain type of well work, we may further define it in that data field. So that's another large component. So again, back to, how do we prioritize these wells? One is population density. How close are we to people, urbanization? Another one is environmental factors, surface water or wildlife. Another is active spills. So if the well is actively leaking, then we will place a higher priority on that well. The good news here is that the majority, over half, are not leaking. Stormwater is also an important point. So if we have a location where the pad was built, let's say next to a gulch, and that is eroding sediment into the gulch, that's going to receive a higher priority. Surface equipment, we need to consider whether or not there are tanks, equipment, anything else on location that needs to be salvaged. Sometimes there are pump jacks still on the well. Sometimes there's fluid in the tanks, so we need to figure out how that's either going to be disposed, reclaimed. One difficulty we have is COGCC does not operate the wells, so actually selling the oil is a problem if we have oil in tanks. And our hearings unit is still working on an appropriate response to that situation. Moving on to the well factors, one is mechanical integrity. So as wells age, and especially if they're shut in or left idle, our rules do require that operators perform mechanical integrity tests. But often for these orphan wells, these older wells that are left behind for the state to deal with, they may be delinquent on their mechanical integrity, or the number 3 shown on here, 25% may have known MIT failures or other leaks evident at the surface. So those will receive higher priority. Also, if it's venting or leaking anything at the surface, then that will receive a higher priority as well. Good news there is, almost 3/4 of the wells that are registered in there right now have no indication of leaks at surface. We look at stopgap measures. So if there's something that we can do to the well, especially if it's leaking, to stop the leak before we can get it scheduled for plugging and abandonment, tightening bowl plugs, closing valves, that type of thing, then we try and take care of that as soon as we can. For task complexity, this comes into play this time of year when we're nearing the end of the fiscal year, and which projects can we get done quickly. Low complexity would, be a good thing to look at this time of year. Looking at access, sometimes we have good access, sometimes it needs work, sometimes we have no access, where we need to build roads or take some other extreme measures in order to get to the wells. And those would be cases where, let's say, it was drilled 100 years ago and there's no longer access. We often have seasonal restrictions to deal with on hunting, crops, winter conditions that we have to worry about. And also we look at the, again, the age of the well, not just the well, but how long has it been on the orphan list. So you'll see in this graphic, most of the ones that we've registered for this calendar year were put on the list within the last few years. But we do have some older ones that may not have received a higher priority in the past that we still need to deal with. So here's an example of a location where we had to deal with site access. This was an irrigated horse pasture on the eastern portion of the location, and there was really no good access. So we had to retain a civil engineering design consultant to look at different access alternatives, and ultimately we ended up building a gravel road out to both of the well pads. We had to worry about installing stormwater BMPs, fences for the horses, culverts, you name it. It turned into a fairly large civil engineering project. So the graphic in the upper left was the aerial photo prior to building that road and the pads, and then that was after building the road and the pads in order to plug the wells. And with that, I'm open to take any questions.
Troy Swain with Weld County. I had a question for you about what's the appropriate response, real-world response to someone who says, I don't want to be force pooled because then I'm responsible for the well.
I'd like to leave that question until tomorrow morning because we're going to have our permitting manager here to talk about pooling and spacing.
Okay. I let you off easy.
Thanks.
Coming.
Okay, my question is from a surface use perspective. When you plug with these abandoned wells, is the only record of that at the COGCC, or do you record anything with the local land records office to notify future landowners that there is a plug and abandoned well on the property?
The only record is with COGCC, so that is, a good point for anyone doing a phase 1 environmental site assessment on the due diligence end, because we've had situations where, commercial enterprises or even other, public enterprises have gone in to construct something, didn't do proper research. Sometimes they're on the website, but again, we may have run into situations with orphans that were drilled 80, 90 years ago that we don't have record of. So we do not have a process in place for deed restrictions or other notifications.
Yes,
this is a state program. Are there things that local governments could or should do to supplement to make sure that they're helping ensure that these things are implemented correctly and to protect the locals from these types of risks?
Well, I think the last question is a prime example. We've added a step. It was, I think, about 4 years ago, where we're making sure to notify the LGD when the work's going to commence, and if there are any local requirements on deed restrictions or other landowner notices, that would probably be an appropriate time to implement that.
You've had to rely on a bond. With what frequency have you found the amount of the bond inadequate to cover the cost?
Well, I would say in many situations we have a case where the bond is inadequate. For these older wells, prior to the changes of the bond rules, individual plugging bonds were set at $5,000, which is certainly not enough to plug most orphan wells. And that was why the legislature in 1990 established the fund, which comes from really the severance tax on production. So in a sense, all operators tend to pay into that fund, in that manner. And that subject came up during the bonding increases in 2009. The concern was if the bonds were raised too high, that would essentially exclude small independents from coming in and exploring new areas or working over certain areas.
Dave, you just want to say a little bit about the money that we have appropriated annually from the legislature for plugging and abandoning specifically. So we do have a fund that is intended to allow us to do some of this work that obviously augments the bonds, the financial assurance, which probably isn't, generally speaking, enough.
Sure. So when I started with the commission about 11 years ago, we had $220,000 per fiscal year appropriated to do the orphan work, and that was increased, I want to say around 2009 or 2010 to $445,000. The intention of that increase was to also pay, if not equal attention, more attention to reclamation issues, and that coincided with the change in our reclamation rules in 2009. Just waiting for Kirby.
Hey, Dave,
Kirby.
An answer. At Weld County, we've got setbacks for putting new structures in, or occupied buildings to active wells and batteries, and also for plugged and abandoned wells. Do you have any guidance that you would put out for like a setback to a plugged and abandoned well? Because I know some municipalities, I've seen them adopting some pretty long distances for plugged and abandoned wells.
Well, we've had that subject come up ever since I started with the commission, and the normal response we have is, we do have setbacks from buildings to wells, but working the other way, if a municipality allows someone to construct something after a well is drilled within 50 feet of that well, it doesn't necessarily work the other way. So it's really up to each municipality to consider those setbacks. I mean, that being said, some of these old wells that were drilled decades ago, sometimes someone builds a house and we have to go in and plug a well that's 15 feet away, 20 feet away from that house. So that's, it needs to kind of work both ways, and planning commissions need to consider that in some way. Okay, thank you.